The Amritsar Massacre, Myth and Reality. A 40-minute presentation held in the Nelson Lecture Theatre at the Joint Services Command Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 13th of February 2008. The speaker is Dr. Nick Lloyd.
In the next 40-45 minutes, I'd like to share with you some of the research that I've been doing on India, particularly the Amritsar Massacre and the related unrest that took place in northern India, in the Punjab, who's up here, in the spring of 1919. Some of you may have some preconceptions or pre-understandings about this period. It is tended to be seen as one of the darkest periods of British rule in India, a period of repression, terrorism and slaughter. Essentially what happened during March and April 1919 was the largest and most sustained series of violent disorders and riots, looting, arson that had been seen in India since the Great Mutiny of 1857. I'm not going to really go into the origins of the unrest and the disturbances in this presentation, but essentially the unrest is an angry and an uncoordinated response to a number of factors. The introduction of apparently repressive legislation called the Roll-Up Bills, which would extend the Defence of India Act into 3 years into peacetime, which was essentially like the Defence of the Realm Act in the UK, because it allowed people to be arrested for revolutionary offences without trial, and they could be held for longer than usual. So there was an unrest related to the Roll-Up Bills. There was also the human and economic costs of the First World War. India is very war-weary and very upset, and very high prices and things like that in this period. And there was also the growing nationalist movement led by Mahatma Gandhi, and he starts a non-violent civil disobedience movement in 1919 against the Roll-Up Bills. His movement is called Satyagraha, which is supposed to mean truth force or love force, and although apparently attempting to follow this sort of non-violent civil disobedience, the disturbances, the demonstrations are marked by murder, disorder, looting, arson, and so on. Here is a map of the Punjab. This gives you an extent of the disorders. We have large and angry crowds gather at Delhi and Lahore, where police and army units have to fire on crowds. We have large parts of the town of Gujranwala are burnt, particularly those buildings associated with government, so railway stations, police stations, banks, things like that. At Kasur, just south of Lahore, we have a train containing British people is assaulted by a great mob. 2 British NCOs are killed. At Ahmedabad in the west, 2 Europeans are also murdered. But the worst violence is here at Amritsar, where on 10th of April, 2 local nationalist leaders are deported. This doesn't go down well with people in the town. Mobs, or crowds at this point, begin to gather and attempt to move towards the European part of the town, called the civil lines or the cantonment. They are prevented from doing so by the police, who fire several volleys. The crowd then basically turns into enraged mobs that goes back into the city and kills every European they can get their hands on. 5 Europeans are killed, and burning various buildings. Various banks are also looted. British authority is only forcibly restored when we have the introduction of martial law across the Punjab, and more controversially by the actions of Brigadier General Dyer at Amritsar. This is a contemporary painting of the massacre. It's not a great picture, I'll admit. Machine guns were not used in Jallianwala Bagh. Essentially, a great political meeting had been arranged for the 13th of April. This meeting had been banned by the British authorities, and of course fearing that a large gathering of people would then result in great crowds of people and becoming angry and going back into the civil lines. This is not particularly welcomed by the authorities, and they're very alarmed at the prospect of this meeting. So Brigadier General Dyer takes a small group of soldiers and he enters this garden, the Jallianwala Bagh, and he fires upon the crowd that is there. About 20 to 25,000 people gather. 379 people are killed and over 1,000 are wounded, and that's the official figures that the government of India came to, although many people have been left with the feeling that there were a lot more. This incident, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, has gone down in history as perhaps the worst moment in the entire history of the Raj. The historian David Arnold, in an introductory text on Gandhi published in 2001, stated that if a single event was to be chosen as the critical turning point in the entire history of India's nationalist movement, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre would surely be it, for it revealed the intrinsic violence of British rule, a savage indifference to Indian life, and an utter contempt for nationalist feeling and peaceful protest. And in 2005, Foreign Secretary Jack Straw expressed his shame and sorrow at the slaughter of innocents in the Jallianwala Bagh. This is him at the Golden Temple at Amritsar. Incidentally, when the Queen visited in 1997, she did not apologise. She just signed a visitor's book, which was the cause of some anger and upset in India at the time. What I've tried to do in my study is it is not really just the massacre that has been criticised and that's infamous. It's the entire way the British dealt with the disorders all over the Punjab, particularly this idea of martial law, and it's also heavily criticised in nationalist accounts. One of the instances you have in martial law is this so-called crawling order, whereby Brigadier General Dyer institutes this rule where should an Indian want to go down a street where an English missionary has been assaulted, they would have to do so on all fours. And the crawling order, and there's various other things like that in the Punjab called fancy punishments, that was sort of name for them, that has essentially gone down in nationalist legend as yet further examples, as well as the massacre, of the brutality of British rule and also the racism that has been inherent in British imperialism. What I hope to do today, I think, is really go and question some of these assumptions that we find in the literature and I think still bedevil our understanding of this really important event in Indian history. And I think really the main point I'm going to be looking at is the British reaction to the disorders, rather than what caused them and so on. So the first half of the presentation, I'll look at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in a bit more detail, and then towards the end I will briefly look at the period of martial law and to really question or see whether the nationalist view of the period of martial law is actually valid or not. Now, it is commonly assumed in pretty much most of the literature, pretty much all the books, that the massacre was a premeditated act of mass murder. Now, there have been a lot of debates on either side of the argument whether these actions of Dyers can be justified or not. But nevertheless, both sides seem to think that he knew what he was doing and he meant what he did. This is the general perception. The second part, I will look at this period of martial law and see whether it was, as it has been claimed, a reign of terror across the Punjab. And also look at the figure of the Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, who's got a very bad press. In some accounts, Sir Michael O'Dwyer and General Dyer merge as to one supervillain. In certain accounts, you get a General O'Dwyer. Of course, they are two very different people. Before I sort of go into the details of this, I'll just briefly give you a sort of an update on the sources for this. As well as the published material, there was a lot of stuff gathered by the Government of India in the official inquiry into this incident. There were 6 volumes of evidence, testimonies, interviews, statements that were gathered from a whole host of people. 1 volume of those deals with Amritsar. It's quite interesting, I think, and it shows you some of the things I'm working on. And pretty much the historians that have worked on Amritsar have solely read that volume, because it's about 300 pages of very small text. There are 5 other volumes dealing with Delhi, Lahore, Ahmedabad, Bombay. So I think really in order to get a full understanding of disorders, sadly you have to read all 6 volumes. I'm pretty much the only person ever, I think, to have read all 6 volumes. I nearly went blind during the course of it. There was also a lot of evidence compiled by the Indian National Congress, as the primary sort of voice of educated Indian opinion. They did their own report and collected a vast amount of evidence. That's also been employed, as well as various things at the India office. Jallianwala Bagh, what happened? Well, at about 5:10 on 13th of April 1919, Dyer leads a small party of soldiers through the centre of Amritsar into a piece of dusty waste ground known as the Jallianwala Bagh. Dyer's party consists of 25 Baluchis and 25 Gurkhas. These are Indian soldiers from the north, armed with .303 Lee Enfield rifles, and 40 further Gurkhas armed only with the kukri, the curved knife. They are vastly outnumbered by the crowd in the Jallianwala Bagh. Jallianwala Bagh is about 6 to 7 acres. About 20,000 to 25,000 people have gathered for this meeting. Dyer's men take up positions on either side of the entrance and immediately open fire. No warning is given to the crowd to disperse. Firing continues for approximately 10 minutes until the crowd, or what is left of it, have dispersed. Now, debate on Dyer's actions has been very fierce. Some writers have defended them. Ian Colvin, a right-wing reporter for the Morning Post, he contends that Dyer fired into a rebellious gathering and saved India from another mutiny. He maintains that this crowd was essentially the same people who had murdered the Europeans on the 10th of April, that if they had been allowed to meet, they would have gone on from the Jallianwala Bagh back to the European settlement where they would have massacred everyone they could find. As you would expect, most writers, both Indian and British and American, have criticised Dyer. stressing both the extreme violence of his actions and also the fact that this crowd was probably innocent, that they weren't aware of the order banning meetings. Many had gathered for a Massacre fair. They were not there for a political reason. And this is the view that I think has really been accepted. In 1920, a commission of inquiry by the government of India censures Dyer on 2 counts. First of all, that he fired without giving a warning for the crowd to disperse. Secondly, that he continued to do so while the crowd was attempting to flee. And Dyer is then sort of pensioned off. It also helps that he's quite ill at this point. Now, why does Dyer act like this? This has been the key question. Most accounts stress the character of the man. This is a man who was deeply imbued with the values of the Raj, who is insecure about the changing world, doesn't particularly like Indian protesters, Indian nationalists, sees them as a threat, and that wants to make a big impression, who wants to make a big statement that you cannot come and protest against the Raj. You cannot attempt to overthrow the British Empire. So a lot of it is back to his character and the fact that he felt very upset at what happened on the 10th and was determined to make a very big statement. Now, in the initial small report that Dyer writes after returning from the Jallianwala Bagh, he justifies firing without warning by stressing that my force was small and to hesitate might induce attack. However, in subsequent statements, Dyer moves on from this. By the 25th of August, 1919, he starts talking about, I quote, a moral and widespread effect. That is what he wants to create. It was no longer a question of merely dispersing the crowd, he states, but one of producing a sufficient moral effect from a military point of view, not only on those who were present, but more specifically throughout the Punjab. Therefore, because Dyer admits that it's about punishing people, it's about inflicting terror upon them, therefore his actions cannot possibly be justified. And also, Dyer's words are an absolute propaganda victory for the Indian nationalist movement, who can actually use his statements, you'll find it in that folder, as yet further evidence of British brutality. However, I think there are a number of problems with this. The fact is that Dyer changes his story. His testimonies are inconsistent, they are confusing, and believe me, they are contradictory. What I think we need to do is to look at exactly what happens on 13th of April. Look at what he knows when he knows it, rather than simply falling back on this idea of this character of the man, which I think will take us so far, but I don't think we should necessarily place as much emphasis as writers have done in the past. This is a map of Amritsar. This is the old walled city. The European settlement is to the north. This is the Jallianwala Bagh. This is the Golden Temple. This is the main street running through Amritsar. This is Hall Bazaar. This is Hall Gate, which has been renamed Gandhi Gate. It's quite interesting because the family Gandhi doesn't particularly have a good reputation in Amritsar for the shooting at the Golden Temple in the 80s. Now, Dyer gets at Amritsar on the evening of 11th of April. He finds the civilian authorities in a state of panic and shock. They have lost control of the city and they are fearing attack. He goes through the city in an armed column on the 12th of April, reading an order banning meetings. If any large gatherings take place, they will be fired upon. And there is also a curfew in place. The population is quite hostile to him, but they're not violent. On the 13th of April, again, during the morning, he goes again through the city, reading this proclamation at these points, various points. The black dots are the points that he reads this proclamation in Urdu and Punjabi, and he also has literature that he gives to people. However, despite this, a large gathering begins to form that afternoon in the Jallianwala Bagh. Dyer gets back to his headquarters about 1 p.m. on the 13th of April. And he doesn't start out to go back to the Jallianwala Bagh, where he fires, until 4:15 p.m. He gets there about an hour later. Now, most writers have assumed that when he returns to his headquarters, and between that period, about a 3-hour period, he essentially devises a plan for dispersing the meeting. He sits down and he thinks, right, I've got to disperse them, I'm going to shoot them, I'm going to kill them. This is his period where he writes his plan, essentially. I think this is fundamentally wrong. And I think this is where I diverge quite a bit from the traditional accounts you'll find. If you read British accounts, nobody really thinks there's going to be a meeting that afternoon. The Deputy Commissioner, Miles Irving, goes to the fort, the Amritsar fort, which is down here, to see to check the defences and that. Because Yeah, a meeting may well have been organised, but it's not going to happen. It's extremely hot in India in April. Everyone is knackered from basically having no sleep for 3 days, and they honestly don't think that people would be stupid enough to gather. So I think, again, it may seem in hindsight that a meeting was always going to take place, but again, if you look at the nationalist accounts of it, nobody's really sure what the meeting's about, nobody's really sure who's going to be there. And I think Dyer honestly doesn't believe that they would do that. He just doesn't think they would defy his will in that manner. The key point of evidence that I think is at 4 p.m. when Mr. John Rahill, the Deputy Superintendent of Police, has been informed by his spies in the city that the meeting is definitely taking place. Now, at 4 p.m. he sees Dyer, and he tells him this. Accounts of Dyer at this point, he is extremely shocked at this. He does not expect this to happen. Rahill also tells him that 1,000 people have gathered there. Barely 5 or 10 minutes later, Dyer is on the move. He barely has time to organise his party, but he obviously feels that this is important, so he has to go and disperse it. Before the inquiry, he states, "I went there as soon as I could. I thought I had done enough to make the crowd not meet." And I think traditional accounts of this massacre and the events leading up to it have confused two things. They've confused Dyer's actions before the massacre and his actions once he gets to the Jallianwala Bagh. Now, because he fires within seconds of entering, they've assumed that he must have planned it in advance. I think this is not necessarily so. Dyer has never been to the Jallianwala Bagh before. He barely knows what it is, barely knows where it is. He has to be taken by the hand with a native guide. He doesn't know Amritsar well at all. And the sight of about 25,000 people in there must have been very unnerving. And I think this is the key point. Dyer goes there after he gets the information from Rahill, and he knows, well, he thinks that 1,000 people have gathered, but he has no other information as to the size or composition of the crowd that he's faced with. He expects about 1,000 or thereabouts crowd of, and then what he gets is about 25,000. Now, that is entirely different, and I think essentially what happens is he panics. This is not what he's expecting, and he loses it. This is another point which should be bear in mind is the entrance to the Jallianwala Bagh. There is one entrance. This is the entrance. It's very narrow. You can't see a lot when you walk up that lane. This is the street. You walk up this narrow alleyway. That's the view you see. Now, since 1919, Jallianwala Bagh has been messed around with. Various bits have been put in it, so you completely destroy the view. This wasn't there. It was sort of far more open. But it is quite narrow. You can't really see a lot. And when you go into it, it opens up. Now, there are other questions with this. Now, this essentially, why does he fire for so long? If he panics, then why would he continue to fire for 6 to 10 minutes? I think, again, this has often been put down to his character, but I think we shouldn't read too much into that. First of all, he knows he needs to disperse the crowd. The only problem is this takes a bit longer than expected. Why? Well, because there are no exits. Well, there are several sort of what you would call exits, but they're not really easy to get from. This is one of the exits. As you can see, there's no way that a lot of people can get through that. That's at the side. Obviously, you'd have to get up this way, and you'd have to be helped up. The other exit at the back is that. Obviously, this building wasn't there at the time, but again, you can see that is an exit. It's not actually easy to get a lot of people out of. The problem is that as soon as he starts firing, all hell breaks loose. You have clouds of dust, and you have people trying to gather at the exits. Dyer thinks they are massing to try and attack him, so therefore he directs fire upon these great crowds of people, which of course results in increased casualties. I think this is one of the points that accounts have not really understood. It's the fact that Dyer has no idea there are no exits. He's never been here before. So the fact that there are still people in there, in the Jallianwala Bagh, moving around after a few minutes is, for him, further sign of they're actually trying to defy his will. And therefore he must keep firing. So I think really what my sort of interpretation of this event places far less emphasis on Dyer's character, on the premeditated idea of this massacre, far more on a series of unfortunate incidents and a series of mistakes, and puts far more of an emphasis on it being a mistake. He certainly gets it wrong, essentially, but I don't necessarily think that it was a premeditated massacre. I think also the question remains as to why did Dyer maintain that this is what he's doing, that he knows what he's doing, that he's going there to create a moral and widespread effect throughout Punjab. Why does he maintain this if clearly it didn't happen? If he made a mistake, if he didn't know what the people were like in there, he didn't know how many were there, why does he maintain this? And this is one of the key questions, and I think if we look at Dyers' career, it can give us some clues as to why he would do this. He's a man prone to arrogance. He feels his orders should be obeyed. He is a man that's full of courage. One of the people who knew him while he was at staff college records that Dyer does not know what fear means and is happiest when crawling over a Burmese stockade with a revolver hanging from his teeth. You know, he has a usual sort of Indian Army officer's career. He's his service on the frontier. He's courageous, he's full of dash, but perhaps lacking in more cerebral qualities. In February 1916, he becomes officer commanding of the Sistan Field Force, which is operating in British Baluchistan, sort of eastern Persia, preventing German infiltration and German influence during the First World War, because they were sending agents over to try and destabilise the Raj. Now, he records a very dashing portrait of this operation in a book he published in 1921 called The Raiders of the Sarhad. The region he was operating in was the Sarhad. And he maintains that he did really well there, and he was the sort of classic Edwardian hero, if you like. The only problem is a recent biography of Dyer has sort of shed a bit of light on this period of his career, and it shows that actually he wasn't that good at all. He basically ignored his mission to prevent German infiltration and becomes bogged down in punitive operations, and he also tries to annex the Sarhad for the British Empire, which is a big no-no for the government of India, who essentially have him removed because he's gone too far. But the account Dyer records in the Raiders of the Sarhad is that he had to leave because of ill health, which is wrong. He likes to think of himself as a great man, as a great hero. In the aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh incident, he is, by certain sections of the Anglo-Indian conservative right-wing view in the UK and India, he is hailed as the hero of the Raj. He is the saviour of the Raj. He saved them from another mutiny. So he could hardly disappoint them by actually saying, well, sorry chaps, I kind of made a bit of a mistake there, didn't I? And again, he feels like a hero because he's made to feel like a hero. And I don't think he can really disappoint them and go back. I think interestingly, which sort of, again, perhaps points us down this road, is if you read accounts of Dyer, when he returns from the Jallianwala Bagh to his headquarters, he is shaking. He is smoking furiously. And the first thing he says to Miles Irving, the Deputy Commissioner, he says, I didn't know there was no way out. I'm just going to move on from the massacre now. Again, this has been the main point of many accounts, is that solely concentrate on the massacre. But what I've done is try to present a more sort of holistic view. So I would like to move on to looking at the period of martial law, which, although it never saw violence on the scale of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, has been seen in a similar way as further evidence of British premeditated violence and racism and things like that. And I think we need to look at this again. Now, martial law comes into force on 15th of April, and it stays in place until August, particularly on areas where the railway lines run through. The common argument, according to the Indian National Congress, is that martial law is unnecessary, cruel, oppressive, abortion of justice, and that it was accompanied by the most fearful methods of frightfulness which a horrible ingenuity of mind could devise. And there are numerous examples of floggings, beatings, torture, false imprisonment, and these so-called fancy punishments. I think the first point to make is that martial law had not been instituted lightly. It is put in place to enable the British officials to maintain control, nothing more. As well as unrest in the cities and the towns of the Punjab, you also have a great deal of unrest in the rural areas. And you also have extensive damage to the railway, transport, communication infrastructure in the Punjab. Many railways are cut, railway stations are burnt and looted, telegraph wires are cut wherever they are and repeatedly cut, which imperils British control of the northwest frontier of India, which is the key province for a control of India point of view. So this is something that is highly unwelcome to the authorities. On 1st of May 1919, you also have the thing that you didn't want most of all, which is war with Afghanistan. 1st of May, Afghan troops invade the northwest frontier of India, hoping, I think, in some respects to capitalise upon the unrest in India at this point. So obviously, having control of railways and making sure that your cities are safe is of prime importance for the British. Now, there are undoubtedly incidents of abuse. Dyer's crawling order is the most obvious example. This is one of the only photographs of supposed to be the crawling order. There are various other fancy punishments, such as the salaaming order, where Indians would have to salute when they see British officials in the streets. Various vehicles have been commandeered, bikes, tongas and cars. I think a lot of these things, what we need to do is see them in context. Not necessarily to excuse them, but just to see a wider context of the way Britain attempted to maintain control. The crawling order was in place for about 5 days, between the hours of 6 p.m., 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. And we know that about 50 people crawled along this lane. I think it's certainly insensitive and it was certainly misguided, but what I don't think it is, I don't think it was part of a British plan, an organised conspiracy to inflict terror upon the Indian population. I think it was more an example of the fact that nobody really knew what they were doing, and in the heightened atmosphere of 1919, these things were seen as being essential to disciplining the population. Dyer was particularly upset at this lady missionary who'd been assaulted along this lane, and he felt that he had to do something very strong to, again, make a big impression. I think, again, a lot of emphasis on these sort of minor fancy punishments, but I think they don't point to a British conspiracy. I think they're far more of a sort of local reaction. The punishments during the martial law are not instituted solely on a racial basis. 4 Europeans are fined for not allowing their vehicles to be used by the authorities during martial law. And in Wazirabad, we know about, the only person who was arrested was a drunken European who was charged with indecent conduct. One of the chief criticisms of martial law is the level of flogging that took place, the amount of flogging the British authorities did. We have 120 incidents of Indians being flogged for minor breaches of the curfew order, or for stealing, or for being implicated in the disorders. Was flogging another example of British brutality? I don't think it necessarily was. It was employed because it was seen as a deterrent. It could be administered swiftly, and there are very limited jail accommodation in India, and a lot of people are in jail, so obviously you can't put them in jail. In some cases, flogging is preferred because people would prefer a flogging than fines, which they couldn't pay, or which many people would have difficulties in paying. So you get quite a lot, in some cases, people choose to be flogged. Again, it's a difficult choice, I must admit, it's not a particularly nice choice, but the average number of what they call stripes is only 7, which again is not what you find in the nationalist literature, which tends to inflate the numbers. However distasteful flogging and whipping was, however painful and demeaning, I think it should be seen in context. Flogging and whipping are not unknown in India, and about sort of every year in the Punjab, we had at this point 600 to 700 floggings a year. So I don't think that this is necessarily a further example of British brutality, which it has been painted in the literature. I think it's worth briefly looking at the figure of Sir Michael Dyer, the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, and he is often accused of sort of masterminding a diabolical plan to punish the Indian population. And he probably has the worst reputation of any British official in India that I've ever come across. He is a staunch believer in the Raj, and perhaps this is why he gets so much criticism. Dyer actually acts quite responsibly in 1919. He intervenes to prevent Amritsar having a fine levied upon it. He thought the salaaming order was ridiculous and cancelled it. He was instrumental in getting Dyer to cancel the crawling order and various other things. And he has quite a lot of arguments with the military authorities at points about how to administer martial law. And he wants it relaxed much sooner than it was, because he's aware of the political implications that this kind of military rule will have. Having said that, I don't necessarily think it is just a story of military brutality. The Indian Army is in a highly unenviable position. The Adjutant General complains that the introduction of martial law causes very great loss and extra pain and suffering because it prevents British troops, who are all being demobilised at this point, from getting home. They haven't been home for 5 years, so they don't particularly want to stay in India for the hot season. It is also, I think, some of these incidents of abuse and that, I think, it comes down to the fact that nobody that I've come across in the disorders has any experience of martial law. And people see what martial law is very differently. Martial law has not been declared in India for over 60 years. The Manual of Military Law, which is the Soldier's Guide, has 900 pages. Guess how many pages are devoted to martial law? 1 page. Again, nobody particularly knows what they're doing. And I think when we get beneath the nationalist rhetoric and the very simplistic explanations, I think quite a different picture emerges. In certain respects in Lahore, martial law is actually quite popular, because what they do in martial law is they control prices, which prices have been escalating and causes a lot of hardship locally, where people can't afford food. During martial law, British officials control the prices. You can argue they couldn't legally do, but it seems to have actually quite a good effect on people. There are a number of fancy punishments and very distasteful incidents. The calling order is perhaps the most famous one of them. But in every case, as soon as attention comes to the authorities in Lahore or Simla, they are cancelled immediately. Again, I think this tends to point to the fact that it is not a British plan. I talked at the beginning about Amritsar being a very dark period of British rule. This is the memorial in the Jallianwala Bagh, Flame of Liberty. My view is these sort of very either-or, very one way or the other views need to be reconsidered somewhat. I think really it's looking about the role of violence in British Raj and whether it was as great as some have suggested. And I don't think that this massacre, and I don't think that the period of martial law that followed it sums up British rule in India, and I don't think it reveals the intrinsic violence of British rule that David Arnold suggested at the start. I think the massacre is undoubtedly horrible, but I don't think it is an example of premeditated imperial murder, but rather the sort of a series of unfortunate and unwise events. It's not really the purpose of the study to sort of denigrate the victims or both British and Indian of the violence in the Punjab, or to deny the tragedy and the horror that took place. But I think what I've tried to do is really look again at what first glance may seem a very familiar incident and really sort of test it and really reassess what we know about it, what we think we know about it, and I think really to try and separate myth from reality. And I think only then can we sort of move on from this unfortunate incident.
Dr. Lloyd was asked 5 questions. Question 1. Given Dyer's personality, isn't it most likely that he had made up his mind before he arrived? What do you think were the casualty figures? And did firing continue until they ran out of ammunition?
Obviously, we don't know what would have happened if certain other things had taken place. But I think a lot of this idea of premeditated massacre, it doesn't take into account the size and composition of the crowd. And it is basically that whatever he found there, he would have acted as he did. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think his reaction if 1,000 people had gathered, 500 people had gathered, would have been very different to 25,000. And I think in a certain respects he may have panicked, and once he fires, all hell breaks loose and it's very difficult to rein that in. But I think we mustn't make the mistake of assuming that whatever he found, how big it was, what was it composed of, doesn't really matter because he decided what he was going to do. And I think that is to make a leap of faith that's perhaps a little far. But again, that is where I differ from the traditional view. The view of casualties is difficult. My own personal guess of casualties is around 500 dead. There are a number of problems with getting casualties, is that Dyer, he doesn't stop, he just leaves. The government of India, after, pay people or give money to people who will tell them if they knew someone who was in Jallianwala Bagh to help casualties. The problem is that very few people are going to come forward and say, yep, I was at the Jallianwala Bagh. Why? Because they'd probably be clapped in chains. Casualties are very difficult. Dyer's first explanation is 200 dead. But again, my personal view is it's probably greater than the 379. The figure I use is about 530, which was a figure compiled by an Indian NGO called the Seva Samanti, which did interviews, went to Amritsar in the summer of 1919. It had about 530. When questioned about this, they went through those figures, and about 40 of the people were counted twice. Some people in that list were actually alive when they were in the list as dead. Having said that, I think it is probably greater than 375, but there are all sorts of difficulties with trying to work that figure either way, and to be honest, it is very difficult, so it is probably worth just leaving it at that. The ammunition, how much they fire 1,650 rounds. According to British accounts, they still have ammunition left. They don't have a lot, but they still do have ammunition. We can never be sure, but my view is that they do actually call a halt to it after about sort of 6, 7, 8 minutes, when they actually could still fire on the crowd. I think at this point, though, you have large numbers of bodies in the bag, clouds of dust, piles of wounded. Essentially, you don't have that many targets, if you can use that word. That was the word Dyer used. But of course, a lot of people have escaped at this point, but of course it takes time. Again, we can't be sure how many rounds they had left. I've never found information on that, but the figure they counted when they returned back to the headquarters was 1,650 rounds.
Question 2. Much worse massacres occurred over the length and breadth of India, but these did not reach the papers. What made Amritsar different?
Well, I think it's very skillfully used by the Indian nationalist movement. Having said that, it is used because of the way in which it is investigated and the fool that Dyer makes of himself before the inquiry, really. And he says a lot of things when really he shouldn't have said. The fact that he's talking himself is talking about how he wants to inflict casualties on them. And there's the one incident where he says he would have used armoured cars. He would have used machine guns on armoured cars if he'd have been able to get them into the bar. But of course, he couldn't get through the narrow entrance. It's been taken as a further example of Dyer's brutality. He sort of goes off on one. You could argue that if he'd have simply stuck to the initial report that he writes as soon as he gets back, that to hesitate would induce attack. He may well have been saved. But then he starts going on, widening on his motives, talking about this and that, talking about the wider Punjab, talking about his role, and of course he's fated as the saviour of the Raj.
Question 3. Dyer was not court-martialed. What did happen to him?
He is relieved from his position, sent back to England on the recommendation of the Hunter report, which sentences him on the 2 counts that I mentioned earlier. He is then sort of organising his case. He goes to a lawyer, who then make a long letter that he sends to the Secretary of State, and he maintains that whatever he's done, he should have had a court-martial. He should have had an opportunity to speak. When he went before the Hunter inquiry, he didn't know he was a man in the dock. He had no idea of the questions they were going to ask. This is refused. The army are pretty firm in the idea that they should be court-martialed, but Winston Churchill and various other members of the Army Council managed to kick it into touch, and he's simply retired on the recommendation of the Hunter report. It also helps the fact that he's deeply ill at this point, so there's no real way he could resume duties.
Question 4. Who put together the Hunter inquiry?
The report is called for by the Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, to investigate the disorders, what caused them and how they were dealt with. So they have quite a strong remit. They can't really find a sufficiently well-known man to lead it, so they go for Lord Hunter, who's he's quite an eminent Scottish barrister, but he's not well known in India, and a consistent complaint from British in India is that he doesn't know the country, can't speak the lingo, doesn't really appreciate the way British run India. Even Gandhi, when he looks at it, he admits that some of their questioning was harsher than it needed to be. So I think we have this idea that the Hunter report is a whitewash, and it is all official government doing a job on an unsavoury incident. But actually a lot of what some of the Indians say to the people before it is actually very barbed and very honest, open criticism of them. Numerous British officers are compared to German officers in Belgium in 1914. They're accused of terrorising populations, so I think, whether right or wrong, I think the fact is they were allowed to do that says that they were attempting to actually have some form of open and honest discussion here. And they certainly brought people in who they knew would be critical. Having said that, the Hunter report splits where the minority of Indian members write their own report, the so-called the minority report. The official report is accepted by the majority of the committee. So it splits on racial lines, whereas the minority report is far more critical of the way that the Punjab is run, far more critical of Dyer than the Hunter report. Hunter report is critical of him, but generally says that the British dealt with the disorders in a responsible way. Minority report says that actually they weren't. This is the seeds for the great debate, which echoed on into the years after that, was founded by that report.
Question 5. Is it possible that the crowd gathered for a religious occasion?
It's been claimed one way or the other that a lot of people in the crowd were there for the festival. They'd moved into Amritsar, and therefore they had no idea that the meeting was banned. They were completely innocent people who were just fired upon. Again, it's very difficult to make any firm conclusions. Certain British sources suggest that actually the numbers coming in for the festival were lower than usual. All third-class railway travel to Amritsar is stopped on the 10th of April. They also have pickets outside the city trying to stop people from coming in, because the last thing they want is more people coming into the city in such a disturbed condition. So some people have argued that actually the number of religious pilgrims was lower than usual. And of course this has gone into the great debate about what made up the crowd in the Jallianwala Bagh. Was it innocent? Was it unarmed? Was it there for religious purposes? Or was it a crowd of rebellious people intent on murder? These have been used for the great debates, but as regards evidence, there isn't really much either way. There is some statistical information that I think at the moment I'm trying to go through, but it is very difficult, and we will never know for sure. But I think that is certainly a very good point.
Dr. Lloyd can be contacted by email at nlloyd, spelt November Lima Lima Oscar Yankee Delta, .jscsc at da.mod.uk. Please note that the views expressed in this presentation are entirely and solely those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect official thinking and policy of either Her Majesty's Government or the Ministry of Defence.